All right, maybe you can relate to this. A conflict starts in a relationship. Emotions begin to rise a little bit. The conflict starts escalating. Neither one of you are really hearing each other. At some point, one or both of you disengage from the conflict because you realize it's not going anywhere. We're not being productive. There's some kind of cooling off period. For some of you, it's like a couple hours, others a few days. And then at some point you re-engage again. Maybe it's around the kids or some activity or what's for dinner. You don't necessarily talk about the conflict that happened previously. And at some point down the road, this conflict cycle repeats itself. Any witnesses? Listen, if that's you, what I want to do in this video is I want to give you a practical framework that will allow you to analyze your conflict patterns so that you can eliminate them and not have to keep dealing with them. That's today on RelationShots. Hey, welcome to RelationShots. If this is your first time and you've not yet downloaded the free guide to intimacy, you'll see a link in the description area below. You'll also see lots of other links to resources, to upcoming classes, whatever we may have that might help you in your relationship. So check out the area below. Let's talk about conflict. Conflict is inevitable, right? You cannot have a relationship without conflict, but unhealthy, escalating, repeating conflict does not have to be the norm for your relationship. Part of our problem is we try to evaluate, analyze, and adjust conflict in the midst of conflict when our emotions are high, and that rarely goes well. The key to ending conflict cycles is having a clear process by which we go back and analyze and evaluate so that we can eliminate some of the things that caused us to get to the place that we got. So what I want to do in this video is give you a practical framework. It's called the ABCD analysis, and I actually came across this a few years ago, but the book I came across in was on couples and communicating that was written in the 70s. So listen, some things, some truths are just timeless, but it is called the ABCD analysis, and each letter stands for something, so let's go with it. The A is antecedents. So the questions you want to ask around the A are: what was I feeling? What was going on? What stressors were in my life leading up to the conflict that we are in? So we need to look at this from both an individual standpoint and a relationship standpoint. So around the relationship, what was the atmosphere of the relationship? Had we been connecting? Were we feeling connected and warm to each other, or had there been some disconnection and distance? Were we feeling caring towards one another, or were we contentious towards one another? So what was going on in the atmosphere of the relationship leading up to the conflict we had? And then what was going on in each of us personally? So in me, what stressors might have been going on as I stepped into this conflict? Now, that could be stresses in a relationship. That could also be stresses outside the relationship. What was going on at work? Did I have some stressors? What was going on? So maybe it's my physical health. Maybe it's my relational health with outside people. Maybe it's my emotional or spiritual health. What was going on in me leading up to this conflict? Are there some things that I need to be aware of inside of me that position me to be more likely to step into a negative conflict? So antecedents are important. We've got to be able to come back and go, hey, what was going on in you? What was going on in me? And what was going on in the relationship before this conflict ever started? That's antecedents. B, the next piece, is behaviors. So now we got to be asking ourselves, what were the things we were doing right leading up to the conflict and in the conflict? What behaviors did I have? What things was I saying? What was I thinking? What was I feeling? What assumptions were I making in stepping into the conflict? What was I believing about my spouse in that moment, or in my spouse generally? So let me give you an example of how this impacts. So if I have made the assumption that my spouse does not have my best interest in mind, or that they only care about themselves as I come walking into a relationship, and I'm thinking that and I'm feeling that, then every little thing that they say, every one of their behaviors, every one of their words, I'm going to see through the lens of the assumptions I made coming in, which is going to cause me to turn around and behave in a certain way. And so we've got to look at what are the things I was doing in the conflict. Sometimes that's body posture. Was I loud? Was I moving my hands a whole bunch? Was I in the other person's space? Was I coming in an aggressive manner? Some of you in conflict like to get all up in the other person's face, like you're ready to throw hands, even though you might say, I'm not throwing hands, but it's a power move. What are my behaviors? What am I trying to do? What am I trying to challenge? So we've got to be able to look back and go, okay, what kind of things did we do? What did I say? What did you say? How was I behaving? What was I thinking? What was I feeling in the moment? Were there some assumptions that I was making about you, about the relationship, about the specific situation? We've got to go back and evaluate B, our behaviors. And the next one is C, that's consequences. So what were the consequences of my behaviors and the words I said? In the midst of conflict, I think we don't often understand fully the impact on our spouse that our behaviors and our words have in the midst of conflict. Sometimes we say some crazy stuff. Sometimes we say some mean, vindictive, evil stuff. Sometimes we say some real final stuff. Right? I can't be in this relationship. I can't do this anymore, And so I think a lot of us likely have not probably an accurate understanding of the consequences of our behaviors and our words in the midst of conflict. And so I think we've got to be able to take time to go back and look at that. And if you're wondering, you can probably see what your spouse's answers were to the B category behaviors about the things you did will give you some insight. But I also think it'd be good to ask. Just ask them, hey, what impact did my words and my behavior have? And then just listen. Validate what they say. You may even need to apologize at times, but our behaviors in the midst of conflict often have much longer lasting impact on the relationship that we're not even aware of. We don't know how we fully impact the way that we stood up, the way that we said things, the look in our eyes, or the tone of our voice. We don't know if that scares our spouse, if that puts fear in them. We don't know if that makes them feel hopeless. We may not know what we're doing, especially if we don't remember what we're saying and how we're behaving because our emotions have gotten too high. So part of it, we've got to go back and say, hey, what were the consequences of the things that we did and said in the midst of that relationship on how we are feeling now about each other, about ourselves, and about the relationship. And then the last one is D, do differently. What can you now do differently? Based on the conversations you've had, based on the analysis, based on cooling down as you look back at the situation, were there some things maybe you could have done differently? Did you notice you maybe should have had it at a different time? Do you now notice that there is maybe another option available to resolve the conflict that neither one of you or you did not see in the midst of the conflict? Now, based on reviewing and analyzing and seeing our behavior and all the stuff going on, maybe there's some other options that you hadn't thought about before that you could apply to this conflict. If you want something different, you probably have to do something different. So looking back now, we're not in the emotions of the conflict anymore. We're kind of looking back on it. What are some things you each could have done differently? Were there some areas where we saw it escalating and one of us could have taken an off-ramp and said, you know what, let's stop, let's cool down? Do we need to implement some kind of word that one of us can say when we start feeling like it's escalating? And when we hear that word, we know that stops the conversation for now and we'll revisit it later. What can we do different now that we've looked back at the consequences, the behaviors, the antecedents, how we were feeling, what stressors there are? We've got to be able to come up with a plan to say, hey, next time we start getting into this, instead of doing what we did, maybe there's something we could do different. So the key to this ABCD analysis is we are doing it later when our emotions are not involved, and we're doing it at a time when we both feel good, rested, connected, we're not in conflict, because then we'll more accurately be able to look back and say, hey man, how can we reevaluate how we got there and what happened? And you may find as you look back on the thing, you know what? We were trying to have a conversation when there wasn't enough time. we were trying to have a conversation at the wrong time of night when one of us was tired or one of us was hungry, or we didn't know the stressors that the other person was under because we haven't been connecting and sharing that. And so if I had known the stress that you were under at work or with the kids or with your family or emotionally some other way, I certainly would have not come to you with this if I knew where you were at. And so looking back, we've got to evaluate, hey, where did we get this wrong? What do we need to change? And how do we need to enter into the next conflict so that we put ourselves in a better position to be able to actually have a conflict, because they happen, discuss the conflict, hear each other, come up with a solution, and move on down the road without it escalating, without more damage being done, without us hurting each other. So not only do a lot of couples never solve the conflict, but in the midst of trying to solve the conflict, they actually hurt each other and hurt the relationship more than it was prior to the conflict. And so you got many couples who are sitting there never solving conflicts and doing a ton of damage because they don't know how to resolve a conflict. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to sometime this week grab your spouse, sit down when you guys are both calm and rested, maybe put a time on the calendar so you know you're stepping into it, and say, let's revisit, pick a conflict from the past. And I would recommend starting with one that's not as contentious, not as much of a hot button, not as much emotion involved, so that you can practice on something that's not as severe. But go through the ABCD framework and see what you can learn and what you can do different next time. And then I want you to come back and drop a comment and let me know how it worked, and let us know what worked for you, what didn't work for you in this process, because I think we can all learn from each other and how we implement this thing. So that's your homework for the week. Go try the ABCD analysis on a conflict that you have had in the not too recent distance, and come back and let us know how it's going. And I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.